Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez. I'm the CEO and founder of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization that is committed to nurturing a generation of men who won't buy sex. I'm really excited about our guest today. I probably say that every time, but it's true. He is a dear friend who also happens to be one of the leading experts on human trafficking in the entire country. J.R. Ujifusa has been working on human trafficking crimes and issues related to those crimes for the last 15 years. He's also a special assistant United States attorney for the District of Oregon, focusing on federal human trafficking crimes. He's a senior deputy supervisor of the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, focusing on drug, property, crime, and human trafficking. He oversees the Sex Buyers Accountability and Diversion Program, First Offender Program. He's a commercial sexual exploitation of children law enforcement group. He's part of the National Sex Trafficking Law Enforcement Listserv, and he's the primary prosecutor for all felony prostitution and human trafficking cases within Multnomah County, which is a Portland, Oregon area. There's a lot. JR has trained, presented, and been a guest speaker at numerous national and regional human trafficking conferences and trainings. He's a member of the Multnomah County and State of Oregon Human Trafficking Task Force, as well as the U.S. Attorney's Oregon Foreign-Born Task Force. JR serves as the chair of the National Advisory Committee on the Sex Trafficking of Children and Youth in the United States. He co-chairs the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys Human Trafficking Advisory Committee and the Oregon Department of Justice Trafficking Intervention Advisory Committee. He's been a deputy DA since 2005 and has also prosecuted drug crimes, felony property crimes, violent crimes, sexual assault, domestic violence-related crimes, gang-related crimes, and homicides. It's amazing he's as wonderful a guy as he is with all of that on his plate. In today's episode, JR and I talk about a wide range of topics like how civilians can work effectively with law enforcement, what it's like engaging in this issue from the side of a prosecutor, and more importantly, why we'll never be able to arrest our way out of the problem of sex trafficking. JR speaks with professional authority as a DA, but also the authority of a father, a husband, a grandfather, and a leader in the community. He's arguably our greatest ally, and he's one of my best friends in this work. You're going to love this conversation. Please remember that this is a conversation that touches on sexual violence, and while it's never our goal to sensationalize the trauma of this topic, we strive to speak truthfully about the damage being done. Thanks for joining us today as we explore more of the masculine wilderness.
Today we want to talk about our teen prevention program called My Friends Are Not For Sale. Did you know that most victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation are not kidnapped? Instead, the majority of victims are groomed into exploitation, with groomers targeting students between the ages of 12 and 15. The goal of My Friends Are Not For Sale is to equip students with the tools and resources to help students recognize the indicators of grooming. The campaign brings awareness to high schools and emphasizes the importance for students to know how to protect themselves and their friends from the grooming process. Learn more at epicproject.org/myfriendsarenotforsale.
Hello, Glen.
We can be formal if you like.
We're gonna start there. We're gonna go there.
I used to have a judge who, he's retired now, but he'd require me to say my entire full legal name when I introduce myself. So usually I say Jerry Ujifusa for the state of Oregon or for the DA's office, and he would have me go through my full name.
Your full name?
He would chuckle every time.
So full disclosure, this is Glen Ujifusa speaking with Armando Thomas Perez Jr.
I'm a junior as well.
Yeah. So it's just junior and junior here. No, I'm really grateful to be doing this. It feels weird because we have talked and presented in so many different places. We have a really long history together in this work. I was trying to think, JR, today when we first met, and it's been so long, I can't remember. I don't know if you do.
I know it was surrounding the sort of trafficking county meetings, right?
Oh, that's right.
And
yeah.
Diane McKeel was the county commissioner in charge.
That's right.
So it was right around that time. And if I remember correctly, there was sort of a community meeting where people from the community would come and we'd update individuals on what we were doing. And it was sort of the infancy of that county meeting.
Right.
I remember us starting to chat a little bit, if I remember correctly, somewhere around there.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That I think that is when it first started. But you are, I get to brag about you a lot, and I do, because you're obviously a longtime friend in this work. But you are the senior deputy district attorney. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
For Multnomah County, which is Portland, Oregon. You are also, is it AUSA assistant or no?
Yeah, they call it a SAUSA, which is a special assistant U.S. attorney, which means I'm sort of borrowed from another county.
Okay.
Yeah.
To prosecute. And then you are the chair for the National Advisory Committee on the Sex Trafficking of Youth in America. Or is that right? That's the
Youth and Children in the United States.
Youth and Children in the United States from the Department of Redundancy Department. That's a long, it's a long time.
We call it the NAC, but it's
the NAC.
It's an amazing group of people pulled from all over the country.
Yeah.
I'm honored to be part of, Supreme Court justices and, Rebecca Bender's on there, and just amazing people who do a lot of great work.
Yeah. So, I mean, like from the very local to the very national, like you are so embedded in this work, and you've come alongside us. I don't want to miss the opportunity to say that you have had a huge part in shaping like who we are at Epic and really speaking into our work every time we asked, and sometimes even when we didn't. And I just remember that I think the first time that happened, we were starting the patrols, the cyber patrol program, and you gave us a lot of really great wisdom. But I think one of the best things you did for us is you said, the way you explained it to me, I'm paraphrasing, but you said there's a line, and on one side of the line are allies of law enforcement, and on the other side are agents of law enforcement. And you said you must always stay on the ally side of that line. And I don't know that we've tested that line really very much, but like we're just a bunch of zealous guys that want to make a difference. And so we were prone to make mistakes, and you were wise enough to kind of foresee that and say, hey, you need to pay attention. So I'll always appreciate that. And you were instrumental, along with Mike Gallagher. Really, it was the two of you, Mike at Portland Police Bureau, in opening doors for us all across the country, and allowed us as an organization actually to spread. Because I don't know that it's happened in many years now, but I remember in those early years, I would go to Denver or trying to think Los Angeles or, Detroit or something like that. And I would meet with DAs and police chiefs to talk about what we wanted to do with these patrols. And, cops are suspicious, and, DAs are suspicious, rightfully so. They wanted to know that we weren't crazy vigilantes. And I said, I call JR or call Mike, and a lot of them did, I think, early on, but I don't know if that's happened recently.
No, I got a lot of calls, but it was great to have that conversation. And, part of the reason when you talk about allies and agents, the work that Epic did and has done was so unique at that time, and it still is, but it was so unique that it wasn't something that I was versed in dealing with. And so I had to do my homework. I had a great supervisor at the time who was a good person to bounce questions off, but there's a huge sort of history of case law on agents of the state, right? Agents of police and what they can and can't do. And really, when you're an agent, you adopt all those rules that police officers have. And we wanted to make sure that for anything from how you were viewed to, your involvement in an investigation or prosecution was on the side you wanted to be in. Yeah. It was where you wanted to be on, right? And where you felt comfortable, and where, a lot of people talk about lanes, right? Now that trafficking, there are a lot of lanes. There used to be just one we were all smashed into trying to figure out how to draw a lane. And now there's a bunch of lanes. I think knowing where other people's lanes are, knowing where yours are, and maybe that's a line, maybe it's a small gray area, I think helped our relationship. It hopefully helped Epic grow and feel comfortable with what they're doing. But Yeah, back to your original question. Yeah, I had a lot of calls from law enforcement agents, and I thought it was great that not only did they talk to you and think, hey, it's worth making a call. There are a lot of people who just throw away that number when they got done talking to you.
Right.
If they didn't feel like it was that way. And then having the conversation and talking about how you were similar to like a concerned citizen giving information.
Yeah, neighborhood watch.
That spoke a little bit more to something that they were familiar with.
Yeah. Well, you put the fear of God in me with respect to subpoenas and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, I don't want to get that call, and not that we're completely free of that possibility, but that was so helpful. So obviously we were two men that are part of this work. There's more to your story, and I've appreciated it as I've gotten to know you as a friend over the years, but you are a husband. You are a father of 4. You are now a grandfather of 1. It still blows my mind to say it.
Blows my mind too.
I know. We recently had on the podcast Elizabeth Smart, and I wanted to bring that up because there's a direct connection, I think, between her story and yours that is utterly unique. And where I'm going with this is like you didn't just pick this out of a random list of possible areas of law that you wanted to specialize in. Like there seems to be there's something more that drives your passion. Like where did that come from? You start from that, kind of that faithful moment when you were younger in Salt Lake City. Like trace that line for us a little bit.
Yeah. How long is this podcast?
we got time. Yeah.
At the time, I will say that some of it is hindsight that may have been sort of a silent, invisible hand guiding me. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't as introspective or nor did I sort of feel the weight of some of my experiences until later. So I'll just start by saying, there are many things that have been put into place I've experienced that I think have helped me do my work and where I've landed. Absolutely. My experience with Elizabeth Smart's story was part of it. Part of it is having...
Can you share a little bit about how that played out?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Salt Lake City. I actually, for a little bit, taught Elizabeth's little brother in Sunday school on Sundays. My grandmother actually lived on the same street as Elizabeth's family. And my parents live about 2 blocks from the Smarts, or 2 blocks at that time from the Smarts. And so we knew them. They were a family in our neighborhood. We went to church with them. My mother was friends with Elizabeth's mom and dad. And so they were just sort of neighborhood friends. And I remember, my memory, maybe hopefully I'm accurate, but my memory is that at that point I was married. I got married young, and that's part of my story as well. My wife has truly shaped who I am. I've grown up with some very amazing, strong women, including my mother and my wife. So that's part of it as well. But I was married very young. My son was young. And I remember getting a call from my parents explaining that the Smart's daughter was missing. And if I remember correctly, it was early in the morning, maybe between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., maybe a little bit later. I can't remember exactly, but I remember it was early. Or maybe I was just young, so it felt early. And I got in my car, and I can't remember if my wife did as well. And we drove up. I wasn't living in that neighborhood at the time. I was living in downtown Salt Lake. And we drove to my parents' neighborhood. And I just started to ask, what can we do to help? And I remember a couple of things. I don't remember chronologically. I wish I was a better journal keeper, because some of these things I'm sure I'm not fully accurate. But I remember actually forming up some groups to go search in the neighborhood. I remember going with my dad, and there were a couple of homes that were under construction that people weren't living in that we searched for, right? At that point, no one really knew what was happening, right? We didn't know if it was a kid who had, snuck out and, was in trouble because they had, hurt themselves falling off a rock. We didn't know exactly what it was. And so I remember just going there and trying to help. I remember at the time I was a photography art student. And I remember offering to design their search center logo. I remember putting up flyers on light posts. I remember that neighborhood really turned into sort of a media frenzy. So all those things were kind of happening. I also remember that my sister, who is close to Elizabeth's age, was living at home. So she was in a home 2 blocks away from where this happened. And so that also who's another very strong woman that has affected my life. That also brought things really close to home for me as a college kid dealing with something that turns out later, of course, and as you're going through it, maybe you don't realize it, to a pretty significant and awful and truly affecting for Elizabeth time in my life, but time in that neighborhood, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so that's part of your story that, to one degree or another shaped you. You graduated from the University of Utah, went to law school, and I hope it's okay to say it because I know I've said it publicly when I've introduced you before or referenced you, but you have earned a moniker from your time prosecuting cases. Like you are known in certain circles as the Pimp Slayer because of the court victories that you've gotten. And so I'm bringing that up partly to embarrass you, but also to make the point that guys like you are the kind of guys that guys like me want to be when we think about trafficking, because and I was there, got to be there one time when you won a case against a trafficker, when that gavel falls, it's like, that's such a powerful and it has to be at some level, I think, a satisfying thing. But you were one of the first people, even though vicariously, times I want to kind of live through JR. You were one of the first ones, not the only one, but one of the first ones I ever heard say it. And I've heard you say it multiple times. We can't arrest our way out of this problem. Right. And there's so many reasons for that. But why do you say that? What are some of the reasons why you've said that and continue to say that we can't arrest our way out of this thing called sexual exploitation?
So before we get there, I just want to say, I forgot this, but on my wall behind me, you may be able to see it. It's back there, pointing to it right there. It's actually a thank you from the Smart family
wow.
that I keep in my office just to remind me. Because, after that happened, things such as the idea of trauma bonding, the idea of that, right? When I start to think back on that and start to realize that I experienced, by watching this unfold, some things that taught me later, oh yeah, that I've seen that before. I've experienced that before, or this is how it affected a family or all that. That educated me for sure. But back to, we can't arrest our way out of things. Well, very nice of you to say. I really feel strongly about holding people accountable and protecting victims and being trauma informed and victim centered. And, in some ways, there is no sentence that gives justice to what traffickers have done to victims, right? They have to live with that their entire life. So I do my best and I try to be aggressive when appropriate because I think this is something that does some serious permanent damage to victims and is done with a type of planning and cunning and controlling ways that I haven't seen in prosecuting all sorts of different crimes in this office. But when I talk about you can't arrest your way out of it, I really truly believe that detectives and prosecutors and investigators are a small piece of a very large community that needs to act, that needs to do their part, be in their lane, so to speak, to actually make a difference in the lives of victims. Because at the end of the day, I am required to do certain things. I'm prohibited from doing others. And my job as a prosecutor is one stepping stone that I believe, right? I believe it helps with closure. I believe it sends a message to victims that what happened to them is not okay. But I realize and understand there's a long story before and a long story afterwards that I'm unable to help the way in which maybe I want to, but maybe on my role that victims need help and support and love and forgiveness and understanding and, all those things that we all need. But in order to make a difference in this very complex dynamic, just arresting people and putting them in jail, I've seen does not work. And part of the reason it doesn't work is the dynamics at play, especially in trafficking.
Yeah. I've learned a lot from you, listening to you. We've presented multiple times at law enforcement conferences, and I'm always fascinated when we get into case studies because I get to be again, it's a vicarious thrill to hear prosecutors and law enforcement people break down actual cases, and they talk about, the different tactics and evidence and all that kind of stuff. One of the things that's always stuck with me about when you do that, what I've learned is that it's very complicated. Like the process, I was wondering if you could just unpack a little bit about why are the cases so I guess two things. Why are the cases so difficult to build and to sustain and then, bring to closure, like you said? And then secondly, how is it, what is the experience like for you as a man to earn the trust, of a young woman who's been, victimized by men in, all kinds of ways that we would never imagine? So first part, like from a prosecution standpoint, why are they so difficult?
Yeah, I agree that they are one of the most difficult cases you can do as a prosecutor. They're difficult from the onset. And what I mean by that is they don't look good. They don't look pretty. They don't look ready to go. They're messy. And there's a lot of things that can be challenged. There's a lot of evidence that's difficult to gather. And so what you have is you have dynamics of child abuse, dynamics of domestic violence, dynamics of sexual assault. But you have that in sort of a sub-community of trafficking where there are rules and there are cultures and things that prevent people from talking, rules about what you do with your trafficker. There are all these things that sort of swirl around these cases. And at the very heart of it is, most cases, I need someone in the witness chair to testify about what happened. Usually witnesses in criminal prosecutions are more than happy to do that, or at least willing, because they're the victim of a crime,
right,
of someone who committed a crime against them, and there's some justice and there's some, but that line and those feelings are completely flipped upside down in a trafficking case. And so the first most difficult challenge for prosecutors in trafficking is getting the evidence you need, because the two people who know most and who can testify are your trafficker and your victim of trafficking, who has a very strong relationship with their trafficker, if that trafficker is doing what most traffickers do, which is creating that trauma bond.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, who do these traffickers pick as their victims? They pick extremely vulnerable, extremely individuals who distrust the criminal justice system, may distrust, the government because of foster care and other things. So you've got all that as well. And so now you're asking sometimes a child,
mm-hmm,
come up in front of 12 people and a judge and a DA and to talk about the most horrific things that have ever happened to them, most of them sexual in nature,
right,
and go into detail about those in front of all these people, knowing that their testimony is going to be used against someone they have feelings for to send them to prison. So I think that's the simplest way I can kind of describe it, but there's a whole bunch of nuances in there that make it difficult from even an officer finding out what the story is. I mean, we have time after time, including last night on a mission, that there are victims who the last thing they would ever want to do is talk about who's trafficking.
right.
In order to even identify that is difficult. And then I ask officers and detectives to go one step further, and I ask them to make cases so that even if a victim is not cooperative or not willing to come forward, that we can still go forward, which makes this case even more difficult. So it almost looks like a white collar case combined with other things to go forward on a case where your victim is not going to be relied on for testimony.
Is there a general time frame in which, like how long in general does it take, whether or not you actually win the case, but like how long with these kind of cases can you bring something, does it take to bring something like that to trial? Yeah.
I mean, there have been cases where I could get a call at 3 a.m. and this is a case that has happened in my past where, hey, we've got a 14-year-old at a hotel. Can you come out? And we'll go to grand jury that morning because they're willing to testify. And that case will get indicted the next day.
Wow.
And we will be on a sprint for 48 hours to 72 hours, just gathering evidence, securing evidence, getting interviews, finding witnesses, identifying where these commercial sex acts happen. So it can be a sprint, or it can be a marathon. I mean, there was a case recently I did where the victim was 15 at the time. And when she was 29, she decided she wanted to testify against her trafficker. Wow. And we brought a case that was 15 years old, roughly. I indicted it 15 years later.
Wow.
And so you can, I mean, there's statute of limitations, but what makes it difficult about cases that old is whether or not we still have that evidence or if evidence was collected. In this case, I think we had enough. We had enough to move forward. That's the challenge on older cases.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have that layer of trust that exists often between a trafficker or between a victim and her trafficker, and then equal amounts of distrust to anybody outside that circle, right? What I know, I can attest to, because I know we know a lot of the same survivors. Like, you have won the trust multiple times with women like that. Why do you think that is? Like, what is it about how you show up in that moment, do you think, like, wins their trust? What are the things that, just...
Yeah. I'm sure I could do a better job, but, one of the things I've always done is I like to, I guess, for lack of a better term, know my enemy, know who I'm prosecuting, know the other side. I've read a lot of terrible autobiography of traffickers.
Yes.
And so I started to think about, what does a trafficker do, right? How do they get someone to be so loyal, so in love with them, so protective of them? And it happens. And so I know that not only, as you said, there's a trust, a loyalty, and many times the victims, in my cases, will say a love for their trafficker.
Right.
And at that same time, that trafficker is creating a disdain, a distrust, a hate for prosecutors, for
right.
law enforcement, for community advocates, for all that stuff. And so I know that exists. That probably exists more than almost any other criminal dynamic out there, because it's so thoughtful in how they do it.
Yeah.
So what I've tried to do with victims, and I hope it's the way that's worked, is to make sure my word is, I'm honest with them. I don't overpromise. I probably underpromise. Make sure I view them and they know that I view them as a human being, as a person who deserves everything that I deserve, and I don't judge them or look at them regarding the choices they've made. And so what I try to do is I try to take off my suit most of all. I try to avoid being in a suit anytime possible. And I try to go out where they are.
Yeah.
So that's why if I get a call, I go out to the hotel in shorts and flip-flops and a t-shirt, or I go to a coffee shop, or I meet them at a place of their choosing. And we have really honest conversations, but I explain to them my role. I explain to them what's going to happen so there are no surprises. And I don't pressure them into doing what I think is best. I think that's another thing that, we're so wanting to get things done. And I can tell you, it is one of the hardest things in the world to know that a trafficker is trafficking a victim and not being able to do anything about it because they're not ready. But that's not my call.
Right.
And by forcing them, I've seen, and I've made mistakes, by forcing them or putting pressure on, it actually makes your case worse many, many times. And it also makes their life worse.
That's got to be so hard, though, because you know what risk they're facing, and yet you allow them the freedom to make that choice. Like, you can't step in and be that. I want to clarify something too, because words are important, and I know you value that. We're using the term victim, and I know in certain contexts it's preferable to refer to folks that have experienced this, either people with lived experience or survivors. But you use, and I understand this, it's a technical term, because from a prosecution standpoint, you have the criminal defendant and you have the victim. So we're using that word, I think, appropriately, but it might sound strange in some people's ears because we don't want to forever label them as a victim. But that's not how you're doing it. That's not how you're using it.
Right, and I appreciate you bringing that up. The first thing I do in every presentation, I actually have a slide that says language is important.
Yeah,
and absolutely, it is important. It not only shapes how your audience views a subject, it shapes how your audience views you.
Yeah.
And I use the term victim because it has a legal term. It has legal rights. The Oregon Constitution has victims' rights written into it. And so when I use the word victim, it's because there are a bundle of rights that come with that term. But absolutely, they are survivors, heroes, people with lived experience. There's a lot of terms for men and women and boys and girls who have experienced this and are experiencing it. Absolutely.
Well, yeah, and I'd go even further. I'd say, like, to men, like, the only people that really should be using that language of victim are people like you with diplomas hanging on their wall, that qualify you to speak to it that way. But I think there's so much more. Like, I have watched you, I have heard others talk about the way in which you approach them. And I just want to say, like, what you described about how you interact with folks that are caught up in this, like, it's absolutely true. And it's exemplary, not just for prosecutors, for district attorneys. I think it's a template, if you will, for how men in general need to show up in this space, even, for most of us, because we're not prosecutors or cops, but, we talk about, in Epic, we talk about generative masculinity. We use that term, and it's built around four things: humility, empathy, meekness, and a hunger or an appetite for justice. And you, I know I've said this about you before, but like, you exemplify those things in a really unique context, though. Like, you show up with the authority of the court behind you that same way. With humility, your level of empathy. Now, what I love, we talked about this with, I think we talked about it with Rebecca too, that just the idea of meekness, it's a really archaic word, not real familiar to a lot of people, but if you dig into it, it's a word that conveys disciplined strength, and you demonstrate that as well. So I want to call that out, because I think the way you show up as a man in this work is actually something that can be emulated and, replicated by other guys. So let me just shift it a little bit, and we can come back around to specific cases. But your dad, you've got 2 sons, 2 daughters, and Paisley. How has doing this work, as you've been raising kids, like, how has this affected you as a dad? Like, how is it? Because you've seen things that I've not seen. You've been privy to things that thankfully I'll never have to see. You've read, like you said, you've read the autobiographies of pimps. I haven't gone that far, but like you do this work, and I know you're not a 9-to-5 guy. So when you go home on the weekends, when you're on vacation, how has it affected you?
Yeah, I try not to let it affect me, but of course it's going to affect me, right?
Yeah.
It's going to affect me. And I try to, I guess, spin it in a positive way, or at least a way that I can learn from. Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you, there have been some cases, not only trafficking cases, but some child homicide cases where I go home and I stare at my kids who are that same age and wonder how I got so lucky, how they got so lucky, how this other person wasn't so lucky. Mm. And and most of that has nothing to do with me or my kids. It has to do with, but I don't think those two things in my life are separate. My job educates me on my parenting. My parenting educates me on my job. Mm. They link, and my challenge is to try to keep my cynicism and my work from overtaking my life, because first and foremost is my family. So I do take the things I learned from parenting. Now my youngest is now a teenager, 4 teenagers and young adults, into the other children and adults I speak with and I deal with, because, they're human beings with siblings and parents.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things to do, this may say a little bit about me. One of my favorite things to do is there's a shelter for trafficked young women here locally. And for a very long time, I volunteered to come in and just have a question and answer. And most of the time they ask me questions like, what's your favorite food? What's your favorite movie? Just to get to know these trafficked youth who are taking a little bit of a time out from their life and going through treatment and all that. And also having them get to know that cops or law enforcement, usually I'll bring in a cop or an FBI agent, are just people that are like them, that care about them. And some of my favorite conversations are talking to, I think the last time it was 14 young girls between the ages of 12 and 16 with staff and counselors there about things such as, it's not okay for adults to do this to you in general, right? I'm not investigating anything. I'm not creating police reports. We're not talking about specific cases, but just being able to talk about the value of them and their value, because I think that's something that I try to instill in my kids. I hope I do a good job. So I don't really separate those two. Those two really help me out in the other scheme of things. Sometimes I can come home a little bit down, a little bit overwhelmed with what I see, but then I remind myself of, what I see all day long, 100% of the time, is a small percentage of the community out there. And I get reminded about how amazing human beings are all the time. I mean, I've had a daughter go through cancer twice. I've had kids with struggles. I've had amazing friends and family that do amazing things. So I get reminded that my little job here and the people I deal with here, although I'm surrounded by it all day long, isn't what humans are, and human beings in general are good.
Yeah, I should mention for those that don't know the scope of your work, it's not like you oversee trafficking cases and unpaid parking tickets. What's the technical full scope of your responsibility at the DA's office?
Yeah, so I have a caseload of murder cases, and then I handle all trafficking related cases. So men buying children to traffickers and that sort of thing. And then I supervise, right now it's 13 DAs that do drug and property felony crimes. So I supervise that unit as well.
So just lightweight stuff. Yeah. Nothing big.
Everyone's busy here in this office.
Yeah. Wow. In what ways has this, kind of going back to the family stuff, but in what ways does this strengthen, and in what ways does this test your marriage, just like being in the thick of it? Because that's an even deeper level, right, of connection there. So how does it play out there?
For me, a lot of times it reiterates the importance of sort of a loving relationship, right? You see the breakdown of that, whether it's parents or kids and parents or spouses. And so for me, I don't know what my wife would say, but for me, it makes me really grateful for what I have.
Yeah.
I really like that you focus on the word humility and meekness. Very kind comments, although I don't think they're fully true, but I do like those two words a lot. I think the strongest men I know hold those in spades, right? The loud, sort of tough guys of the world, I don't think are actually the people that I view are manly men, are men who they're men who, they do things behind the scenes. They do things without praise. They do things because it's the right thing to do. They do it not because of how they'll look, but how they believe it should be. And I think part of that goes back to humility and meekness for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what you described, as a friend of mine described. You both described justice as just a sense of the way it ought to be or the way it should be. And you don't care about, those are the guys that don't care who get the credit. I've talked about this in other contexts. I always liken it to, I call them the anonymous fat guys. It's the offensive linemen on the football field that, and then because this is the position this is the only thing I was good enough to play, but it's the guys who, if we show up and do our job, no one ever knows our name. It's usually when we make a stupid mistake is when our number gets called, but we don't score the touchdowns. We don't do the press conferences. We don't, but if we don't do our job, then nothing, the ball doesn't move forward. And that's kind of what you're describing is guys who show up and know the way it ought to be. And it ought to be the case that 16-year-old girls, don't get pulled out of cars like, with 40-year-old guys who just paid a ton of money to purchase them. I mean, it ought to be different in the world for young women like that. So I love that. I want to circle back around because all this is in my head is leading me back to we can't arrest our way out of it. I guess the question is, if we can't arrest our way out of it, we need people to sit where you sit and where Christy and Mike and other, friends of ours that are literally on the street combating this. We need that. But if we can't completely eradicate the problem, what else needs to be done in your opinion? And I'm thinking more in terms of in the world of men, like what work needs to be done with men, young men, older men in general that you think can maybe, if enough of them, kind of figure out what's going on, we might actually change things for the better. What needs to happen with men? Yeah,
I totally agree that there still needs to be all this other stuff too. But when boys, and I want to start with boys, because I think when you're a man, it's much harder to learn this. This needs to be taught to boys. And this needs to be taught to young boys. An honor and a respect for yourself and others and the women around you. Sensitivity and an understanding that it's not weak to be thoughtful. It's not weak to be kind. It's not weak to, stand up for the underdog, stand up for the one being picked on. My youngest son's a great example of that. But I think that has been really lost in a culture where, yes, we hear it. Sex sells, absolutely. And the big, tough, mean guy gets the credit, right? They're the ones scoring the points. They're the ones, whatever it may be, whether it's athletics, but until we reward and honor those more important traits, I think we're going to be sort of spinning in the same thing we're doing.
It's fascinating though, because you started and you kind of tripped me up there because you started to say we need to love and honor. And I thought for sure you were going to say love and honor women, which I know you value those things, but you say it starts with loving and honoring ourselves as human beings. Like, can you say more about that? Like what do you think?
I think you treat people different when you're whole. I think you treat people different when you have the self-respect to hold yourself to a higher standard. I think you treat other people different when you know how you should be treated. I mean, I think that's all are related in a way that you can't divide it. And
right.
There's been a long conversation for many years about the objectification of women. And it seems to focus on women, which it should, but it also needs to focus on what is that telling our boys?
Right.
What is that telling, when every boy, everything they see is about images and sexuality and sort of testosterone filled activities, and gives no credit or explains to society that people are weak if they're sensitive, if they're thoughtful, if they're kind, if they're, if they avoid conflict because they want to look past that moment. And so all of that leads into this whole idea that you're something I can pay to get what I want or use to get what I want, or I can do this because I don't have any, either self-respect or expectations of myself, or that idea that character is what you do when no one else is watching, that idea.
Yeah.
That I don't hear that anymore. I don't see that anymore. I don't see that as being a conversation that our youth, I mean, I have a lot of youth over at my house. So I'm with a lot of youth.
Yeah.
That's not the overarching theme of the youth that I'm around, unfortunately.
Yeah, because you're legitimate. Well, you're a soccer coach. You're not a soccer dad. And then what's the other term? You're the prop pop.
Yeah, I coach.
You're in the dance. Yeah.
Yeah, I help out with dance team at a high school. I try to be involved. I used to be middle school. I used to chaperone the dances there. I mean, I observe kids not only from work, unfortunately, but in just my social life, because I think being involved is one way to keep your kids doing what they need to be doing and knowing their friends. But there are some very basic things that have gone away from us as boys, as men, as parents, teaching young men and young women. But if we're talking about boys, we're talking about either raising boys to do what you do, Tom, and others in your patrol, which is to find people who need help and help them, or teaching boys to be buyers and traffickers. I mean, that's the opposite spectrum of what we're talking about, right? When you purchase someone because you can't see them as a human being and you look at their vulnerabilities as an advantage for you, or you look at someone and you see their vulnerabilities and their needs as requiring you to do something.
Yeah. How old's your youngest son?
He's 14.
Okay, so 14. So what do you think then, given what you're saying, what things need to happen or should happen so that a 14-year-old doesn't become the 32-year-old that got busted in the mission that we helped support last week, as a sex buyer? Like, that's a big window. It's a lot of time and a lot of opportunity. So what if anything? I mean, I've talked to some people like, I don't know. It's a lost cause, but I don't believe that. I know you don't believe that. But outside of building cases against criminals, what other kinds of things do we need to pay attention to and invest in? Like, I'm trying to think of like more the positive end of this. Like,
yeah, at this point, I see that my son's sphere of influence is moving away from my wife and I and his siblings to his friends.
Which is normal.
Which I think is right around that time. So
yeah,
I think it starts earlier, right, than 14. And I think some of the ways is how I treat my wife, how I talk about my wife, how I talk about other women, how he experiences other women, whether it's on TV, whether it's interactions I have with them. So one of the biggest things is by example, right? By your action.
Yeah.
You can say whatever you want, but every one of my kids is smarter than I give them credit for. And sometimes, and they observe, they know, they watch. Absolutely. So part of it is our actions and our interactions with vulnerable people, with people who are in need. Absolutely. There's that. And part of it is the ability for them to trust, to come to you when they have questions as a parent. I know we're getting into this parental advice, I guess, but if my sons can come to me when they're starting to head that way or have questions, or someone sends, the big thing right now is sharing and sending photographs. If they can come to me at the beginning and I can have a talk about how that affects them and how that affects the person whose photograph is for the long term, before they're desensitized to it, before they sort of lose that feeling and they realize, oh, I'm part of this thing that's going to hurt someone else. I think them trusting and being able to talk about that, and parents being able to have hard conversations. I mean, we joked around. I've taken not my 14-year-old, but my 16-year-old, my 20-year-old, and my 25-year-old out on mission. And we've talked about what's going on in their community.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not as a joking way, not as a, oh, look what we're doing, as a, isn't that sad? Isn't that hard? What can we do to help?
Yeah.
Sort of, I'm not the master of that, but.
No, but you do it really naturally. I saw you last week. JR and I did a parents information night that was really well put together, and literally no parents showed up. It's kind of discouraging, but I watched you talking with a couple of the students that led it at the end. And if you remember that conversation at the doorway, and I don't know exactly how we got to this particular aspect of it, but you talked about how kids will often, when they're being lured away and they're being, groomed, will start to isolate themselves, and their friends will cover for them.
Yeah.
And your advice to them is fascinating, because it had both like parental authority, but it also had, just honest to goodness, like legal authority. What the outcome is. Can you tell? You remember that story? Can you?
Yeah.
I want you to tell it.
Sure. I think this goes right along with what you're saying. So thank you for reminding me about that conversation. I regularly tell kids, especially when we're talking about trafficking, that when you think you're helping out a friend by covering for them, oh yeah, that person's sleeping over at my house. Just tell them I'm sleeping over at your house. I've got this new boyfriend. He's awesome, but my parents aren't going to let me hang out with him. So will you cover for me? Right? That was around when I was a kid, right? Maybe not for trafficking, but other things.
Right.
As I know that traffickers, if they can isolate a victim, they are on their way to trafficking them. Not only is that something where you're actually not doing your friend any favors. You think you're being the cool friend, but actually what you're doing is you're facilitating and helping that trafficker stay under the radar longer. And by doing that, maybe by the time it's identified that your friend is being trafficked, it may be months down the road where it could have been stopped at the beginning, before that grooming even took a hold of these victims, or before these victims even thought about engaging in sort of the acts that their traffickers want them to. And so I talk to a lot of youth about, like, when you think you're being the cool friend, it's kind of like being the cool parent, right? I'm probably not the coolest parent in any circle, because I'm a parent. My job is to protect my kids, not to be their best friend and to be the cool guy.
Yeah.
By being the cool friend, sometimes what you're doing is you're enabling, or even aiding and facilitating, if you want to look at it that way, in the grooming process of traffickers who are trying to isolate and control. And if your parents don't know where you are and people are lying to cover for you, in some ways, yeah, that could just be a sleepover. Absolutely. I'm not saying every time a friend covers for them, the person's going to be trafficked, but we see many cases where it could have been identified on week 1 and it's identified on month 4.
Wow.
Because friends have covered. They've hidden it in such a way because they thought they were being friends. And many of those friends, I had a case with a serial rapist that was a buyer, that a lot of those friends were like, I feel so bad, I introduced my friends to this person. Or I covered for them, or I invited them over to my house when we were on a camera Snapchat with this person, because you're actually helping.
Yeah. Yeah, that was such I know those kids fairly well, and they're super sharp. They listen, but it was just, as I was listening to you talk to them, it's like, it was just the weirdest combination of both, legal, moral, and parental authority with which you spoke. And I just think that's so cool. Anything else just in terms of how we show up in the world as men? Like, are there other areas that we should be paying attention to that can maybe not eradicate things like sex trafficking, but could mitigate and reduce some of the violence that's being done to vulnerable people? And it's not just girls either. I mean, I think we've said that before. But
we have. Yeah. They're, victims are all genders, all shapes, sizes, all socioeconomic classes toward traffickers. Tom, we had this conversation, I don't know if you remember, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and we talked about what are some of the things that it would take for society to be less tolerant of this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, society is extremely tolerant of it. I mean, I live in the Pacific Northwest, which is known for a very tolerant legal sex industry, which can be challenging as well for combating trafficking. And one of the things, just sort of when we were spitballing, that I said, which I mean, I may not be as articulate as I'd like to be, which is when trafficking becomes as unpopular as child pornography, when it has that stigma, right? Really, in many cases, it overlaps. You're engaging in sexual acts with a child.
Yeah.
But child pornography isn't something that men in normal circles talk about. They don't brag about it. They don't openly go on forums and talk about it to the extent that they do with trafficking. I'm sure they do in small circles. But when that stigma in general as a society, by educating people to understand what this actually means, what the details of commercial sex are, everyone glosses over it. Hollywood glosses over it. Stories gloss over it. When you talk to individuals who are either pro-sex work or other things, it's very much glossed over, because when you sit down and you hear an interview from a 16-year-old who talks about 5, 10 dates a night lined up of strangers they don't know, who treat them however they want to be treated because they think they own them, and you start to get into that level of detail of what's going on, I can't imagine anyone enjoying it, wanting it, not being extremely fearful, but also thinking that this is a profession, a choice, all those things sort of wrapped up that we talk about when we're talking about on the 30,000 foot view of commercial sex. Oh, it's making money through sexual acts. There's a deeper detail that I think when the public actually thinks about, and when education comes out, and when we talk about the victims and how they're victimized and chosen and groomed because of their sexual abuse history, because of their lack of parental figures, because of their distrust for male figures, because of their, all those things, they're picked to then be exploited more. When that actually becomes common knowledge in a way in which I think many people know, and when men show up to represent that that's not the way it should be in the numbers that women show up to represent how it should be. I mean, you and I have talked about when we go to a conference, unless it's a law enforcement conference, that's mostly law enforcement. When you and I go to a conference that's a mix of everything, there are very few men, unless they're police officers.
Yeah. You and me and all the ladies, oftentimes.
And that's how it's been for a very long time. It's getting better. But
it is, but women show up. They show up to get stuff done, and men not always, with respect to this issue. My mind is racing with all kinds of things. The one thing I was going to say, as you were unpacking what needs to happen, it needs to become like something like child pornography. I've heard it also compared to smoking. That the shift is something like that. I grew up in the era when everybody smoked, when doctors were spokespeople for cigarette brands. And my dad was a doctor and my dad smoked, and now it's changed. But can we get there simply by writing better laws, or does it require more will than just legislative will?
Yeah, absolutely. It requires more than legislative will, more than law enforcement will, more than prosecutor will, right? It is a shift in how an entire group of people see something. And part of what I'm trying to say is, if they were to know what the realities of trafficking were, we would get there, right?
Yeah.
It would become that.
Yeah.
Because there's no way you can see all this heartbreak and trauma and violence and control and exploitation and not say, how awful is this for our community, for men all around me, and I mean men, traffickers and buyers, to be doing this at their lunch hour, to be doing this while they're at work, to be doing this in between Uber rides, to be doing this, as a way to stop before you go home and go to a kid's birthday party, like all these things. How can that possibly be in an educated, free society that should know better? Yeah.
One of the things that haunts me, there are several examples of this, but in the early days of our cyber patrol program, it wasn't a call I was on, it was one of our other volunteers, but they got the guy on the phone, the buyer, and before the buyer knew that it wasn't a young woman on the other end, but it was one of our volunteers, his comment was something to the effect of, "Hey, can I call you right back? I'm just putting my daughter to sleep." It's like, I'm going to do this, but let me first be a dad and put my daughter to sleep. It was like, it's such a haunting thing. Like, how did we get there? I know another one I had directly involved in was supporting one of our teams, was visiting one of our teams, and I was fielding incoming text messages, and up pops a picture of a young guy in front of a bathroom mirror, buck naked. And the only thing the text said was, "Hey, I just turned 18, looking for a quickie. How much?" And I'm like, how did we get there? You know, and I thought, if this kid just turned 18 and he already knows how to play this game, like, what's he going to be like when he's 30, and how much damage will he leave in his wake along the way?
Where did he learn that, right? Where'd that
come from?
How do you get into that pool? You're in the deep end already. I mean, I will tell you that throughout the dozens, maybe 100 missions I've been on, you know, I've been doing this for now 15 years. We've had men who are driving on high-rise areas trying to pick up women with their children asleep in the back seat. We've had men who, when arrested, buyers who have said, "Hey, I can't go to jail. My wife is literally giving birth right now."
Wow.
And we followed up, and that was true. And so, the question is, how do you think that you can straddle those two worlds, right?
Yeah.
And it's a natural thing, and you don't say, how am I not being hypocritical? How am I? Because when you ask these men, whether they're traffickers or buyers, "Hey, would you be okay with your sister doing this?" What is their answer?
Yeah, it's always no.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
But it's okay if it's someone else's, by all means.
And so that empathy, maybe when we talk about some traits, that empathy and that not thinking about just myself and my needs and what I want absolutely goes into the equation. But it is amazing to see.
Is there a case or a particular part of a case that really haunts you just personally, you know, as a man, husband, father? Is there something you could share? Yeah,
there are pieces of a lot of cases that I think about on a regular basis.
Yeah.
You know, the younger the kids are, it always haunts me. But I remember there are a couple cases, one in which a young woman, she was a minor by far. I think she was maybe 15. She was trafficked by a trafficker who I went to trial with, and she was extremely vulnerable, not from this area, lost. And of course, like a shark circling its prey, this trafficker was circling her at a bus stop. But one of the comments that haunts me is she says maybe the first or second day he had brought her into his house and he was sexually assaulting her under the guise of being her boyfriend, although they were 45 years apart almost.
Yeah.
She says, "Hey, I have something to tell you." And he looks at her, they're in bed, they've just engaged in sexual acts, and he says, "You're 14. And she says, "Oh no, I'm 15. And so that trafficker, there's a lot to unpack from that statement. One of them is he actually believed she was younger than she was.
Wow. And it was totally okay.
And not only was it okay, he's like, "Yeah, you're going to tell me the secret. I already know what it is." Right. I mean, that's one of those when I think about that's one of those that when I first heard that victim, that very courageous victim on the stand state that, I was, it sent chills for sure, because it was that's one of those details when you talk about if people only knew, right? 15-year-old, 14-year-old, I mean, that's end of middle school, beginning of high school.
Yeah. Yeah. Does it surprise you that we don't ask, how did we get to the place where those stories have to be told? How did we get to the place where these, hellish things are happening? Does it surprise you that people don't ask those kind of questions? Yeah.
I mean, the old adage that I feel like I'm downriver pulling out from the river and wondering, how did they get in the river? Right? Absolutely. I mean, much of a prosecutor's job, unfortunately, although we try very hard to be proactive, is reactive to things that have already happened.
Yeah. By definition, your job is to be downriver.
Yes, but I think as prosecutors, we need to be upriver. And absolutely, I in no doubt, I believe that just like victims of trafficking, traffickers have had some traumatic things in their history as children. Absolutely. Yeah. And from the studies I've seen and from the cases we've sort of dissected, that's absolutely true.
So same vulnerabilities that lead to people being exploited, right? Oftentimes, right?
I believe so. Yeah, often. Yeah. Often, physical abuse, sexual abuse, familial trafficking in their home.
Poverty.
Absolutely. Poverty. Yep. Unstable home life, all sorts of things, absolutely. But we should be asking those questions. But not only should we be asking those questions, we should be focusing on how do we support the opposite of that? How do we strengthen homes and families?
Yeah.
How do we strengthen the ability for children to be protected from abuse? How do we strengthen, I think all those things are investments that will pay off tenfold.
And those are the upstream considerations.
Those are the upstream considerations. But,
yeah,
as you know, that's a gigantic lift.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I would argue, I think this is the position we've tried to take, like with Epic, is that's not all on you. I think I've even said that publicly at times, like the upstream stuff is not all on prosecutors and law enforcement, even politicians. Like if anybody should be upstream, it should be the people in the community, it should be the men who are, most men are never going to buy sex, but most men aren't doing a whole lot to stop those that are. So I mean, there's a whole bunch of work to do there, but it's not all on law enforcement by any means. I have to just want to go back real quick because I don't want to forget this because it's painfully funny, but can you share the story of the training you guys did when the buyer crashed your police training? You were there that day, weren't you?
I was there that day. Yeah. I have had the privilege to work with some amazing people, and law enforcement is no exception to that. So during our trainings, to bring home how prolific.
Who were you training? You were training cops, right?
We were training cops. It was at a law enforcement facility outside Portland metro area. And as a demonstration on how prolific buying is, because absolutely, especially back 10 years ago, all these smaller areas would say, this only happens in Portland.
Right.
This is a big city thing. You guys know what you're talking about. We don't need to get trained. We've got our own problems. Absolutely. There still is. And you've heard me say the adage, if your community has the internet, has money like sex, you have trafficking problems. It's true.
Yeah.
And so in many trainings, the way to bring that home was we would do live, we'd set up ads before the training began.
Yeah.
And we would have sort of real time calls coming in and seeing if we could set up undercover date to arrest that person.
As a part of your training.
As a part of our training to show like, look, your neighbor down the street, they just called. These people are from your area and they just called and look, we got 20 calls in, 5 hours. I mean, we did this in Eastern Oregon. We did this in Southern Oregon. We did this on the coast. Everywhere is the same thing. And it would be everywhere in any state because we all have the entire world in our pocket in a cell phone. So anyway, and also to show that just how, if tunnel vision is the right word, thinking with the wrong part of your body, however you want to say it, these buyers are, we gave them the address to the law enforcement facility that, of course, was advertised. It wasn't a hidden law enforcement facility to meet us, to pick us up. And sure enough, I want to say 20 minutes later, we get a call, hey, I'm almost there. And this individual pulls right in the parking lot of the police facility to then be meted by many people in the training and arrested for agreeing to engage in commercial sex.
He showed up at the police station.
Yeah, it was illustrative of just exactly, one, how easy it is, how prolific it is, but also how sort of just in the moment, maybe just, I don't know, but it was funny at the same time, pretty sad how ridiculous that can be. Yeah.
I had a similar experience. I don't know if you were at the cease training we did in Houston years ago. I don't know if you were there or not.
I think I was there, actually.
Yeah, when we did the patrol demo with a room full of 300 cops or something, and we had the phones were just lighting up, and one guy called in and said I think he said it on the microphone or to the group that was huddled around the computer. He just said, "Oh my God, I'm a federal officer." Like he outed himself. And this was in the middle of the day in Houston, and you got a guy, FBI agent, I think, some kind of federal agent calling to buy sex. So it's, it's all shapes, all sizes. I have said publicly, you tell me if I'm in any way inaccurate, but people have asked, who are the buyers? Who are these guys? Because we want to paint the picture of them as the creepy guy in the trench coat across the street from the grade school, right? And my answer to the question, who are the buyers, is I've said, go to Applebee's on a Tuesday night and look around. It's a cross section of every guy in your community. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, in some trainings, we've played the game where who is the buyer, and we've had mugshots up.
Oh, yeah.
Right? People would try to pick it, and they'd always pick the creepy looking guy. And it's, sometimes it's them, but sometimes it's not. Most of the time it's not. But, I've been on missions where we've had doctors, pastors, CEOs, accountants, attorneys, all sorts of things. And so when people ask me that question, because I've looked at the data from our sex buyers accountability class, I've looked at some other things. The closest group of men that I can think of in the criminal justice system is similar to people who get DUIs.
Wow.
And if you think about that, think about how many
demographically, you're saying? Yeah. Okay.
Think about how many people who have had a DUI, right? I mean, you see in the paper sometimes some pro athlete, some actor, some politician will get a DUI.
Yeah.
It's that cross section, right? It's people who they may not be involved in other criminal elements, but they're have enough money to drive a car, right? All that sort of stuff. But as far as the demographics, I would say in the criminal justice system, if you were to liken them, it's probably DUI defendants.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like we could go on all afternoon swapping stories of stuff that we've heard and stuff that we've seen. There's a whole lexicon full of terms, right? I mean, there's a vernacular among sex buyers, and just that whole ecosystem that's really troubling. And I don't want to go into that. My point in that is like this work is hard. You see it at a level that most men never do. You have to literally deal with the evidence and the firsthand accounts, and like that weighs heavy. And I know we've talked about it a little bit ago, just like it can affect you. I know you go home to an awesome family, and I think I've said it to you before, you married way over your head. And you're the first one to admit that as well. But, and I'm really grateful for that. But what else? I'm setting you up because I really want you to geek out on this. I know that there is something that you do regularly, not as regularly as I know you would like to do, but there's something that is just very life-giving to you. It involves water.
Yeah.
And just paint a picture, if you will, of that relationship you have with water and fly fishing. Because I know you do other things. You're more well-rounded than that, but I know given a choice, that's just a super life-giving thing for you. So what is that? Paint a picture like not JR the prosecutor or the dad, but JR with a fly rod in his hand and his waders on. What is that like for you?
You're making me smile just talking about it.
I know.
Next time we'll talk, we'll be in a river.
I can see your dad's carving behind you.
Yeah, my father-in-law's carving. So as long as I can remember as a kid, I've loved water. I love the ocean. I would spend my life in the ocean if I could.
This is kid from Salt Lake City?
Kid from Salt Lake City. I love the ocean. But, sometimes my worlds collide. There have been many times I've been in the water in my waders taking a phone call.
Wow.
About a trafficking case. I remember once getting a call that one of my victims had been killed while I was fly fishing. But, okay, I'll paint the picture. There's something about standing still in a moving body of water and the challenge of course, I catch and release fish. My wife does too. My wife's a much better fly fisher than I am. My kids love fly fish too. But there's something for me that is very cathartic about sitting in a quiet river. Of course, there's some noise, and watching and being patient and slowing things down. I don't know. There's something, as you know, any DA's life is super fast paced. It's busy, busy, busy.
Yeah.
Constant calls, constant emails. I had to turn off my computer because it would just be dinging with emails and stuff. But there's something I love about that. And I love about watching a fish come up to the surface and grab a fly that I've tied. Most of them I don't, but once in a while I do.
Yeah.
And there's something about, I'm not a big hiker, but when I'm next to water, I could walk all day long in some waders with a rod in my hand. And I love to do it with others, but I also love to do it by myself. It's one of those things where I could just sit in a river, and it doesn't mean I have to catch anything, or I can catch very small stuff. I'm not someone who's looking for a record, but just it's one of the ways that from all the other things that keep me, I guess, grounded or balanced, being on a river is one of them for sure.
if this exists for you, where is the ideal stretch of water? Take us there. Where would that be? I
Sure.
think of a couple based on what you've said, but
Yeah. I mean, I won't give any names because I try not to share my fishing.
you know what?
but right before sunset, when you've got that sort of warm glow, you've got a hatch out, so there's bugs on the water, and the fish have just woken up, and they're starting to make that water look like it's bubbling. And for me, usually I'm shaking, trying to tie my fly on as fast as I can because I see what they're doing, and being able to just focus on one fish at a time and perfecting your cast. Some people like golf because you can never perfect it. I love just trying to cast and perfecting my cast and trying to present a fly that looks like a slower river where I can stand in the middle. I don't like being on a boat. I like having the river up to my waist, the sun beating down and cold on your legs because it's cold water. And I don't know. That's a great activity when I'm not doing other things, for sure.
So besides the rod and reel, because I know you don't just have one of each of those, what's the must-have piece of gear? I like to wet fly. So some people say waders. I mean, a good pair of waders is fantastic for sure. I probably have too many flies. That's probably something you need to be careful about, is overdoing it. But I mean, my wife will say sometimes I'll geek out before a fly fishing trip. I'll rearrange my fly boxes, make sure my flies are all ready to go. That's a pretty embarrassing thing to admit, but sometimes simple things like that. Or you put them out on the bed or what?
Yeah, sometimes I'll take them all out of a box and be like, hey, this is where I'm going. This is what I need, and sort of get my bag ready for that trip. So
yeah. Is there a place you want to fly fish that you never have yet?
Oh, sure. New Zealand is a great place to fly fish. I love it. There's some South American places to fly fish. There's some big rivers sort of in the Midwest I'd love to fly fish. So like I said, I'm content. If it's a body of water that has something moving in it, I don't care if it's the biggest fish. I don't care if I catch a bunch. I enjoy the process for sure.
Yeah. It reminds me of a book title one time, and it was kind of a love story for fly fishing, which you probably could have written yourself. And it was titled "Walking in a River Waving a Stick."
Yeah. For those people who don't get it, that's exactly what I'm sure it looks like. And they're like, it's a very expensive stick.
It's a very expensive stick, and you're okay that they think that that's what it is, because that means they're not going to come in the river with you.
Yeah. When I look at my hobbies that I enjoy, the other one I really enjoy, which I haven't done in a long time, is night photography. It's another very technical, quiet, patient hobby.
Yeah.
Your exposures are in the minutes or hours, not in the fractions of seconds.
Right. And yet the result of that is often something really profoundly beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think if I think about your story and just what I know about you, it's one of the things I love is the contrast. And that's why I wanted you to talk about fishing, because it's the contrast between something that's so profoundly ugly and full of pain and violence and, so many trauma and all of that. And then there's this tension that you still make time, you commit time to doing something that's really beautiful. You showed me the carving, the fish that it was your father-in-law. Yeah. And that's one beautiful expression of that. But just that tension between things that are really ugly in this world and things that are truly beautiful. And you live really well in that tension. So I really appreciate that. I just want to give you just a few minutes and set this up a little bit. But going back to your son and your son's friends, obviously you have authority in their lives, but I may never be as a man, I may never be in a position to say something to your son or to his friends. But if I ever did, what's something that men can do, say, or be that will inspire young men like your son and your son's friends? How can we show up for them in a way that is, inspiring and life-giving, not like heroic bravery or anything like that, but I hope that makes sense.
Wow, that's a really tough question, Tom. As I'm thinking through it, I'm going to just sort of start and maybe we'll get through it.
Just riff on it.
You and I are both God-fearing men, and I think part of it is knowing that there's something beyond yourself. Acting as though there's something beyond yourself, and acting as though these are all God's creations, I think is one of them. Having high expectations of men around you and boys around you. You know, I'm involved in my church community. I'm involved in youth sports. I'm involved in other things. And I think we've tried to shy away from having high expectations because it requires some failure. It requires some challenges. It requires some correcting. And I actually think that I have learned tenfold in my failures than I have in my successes. Not only have I learned from them, I've learned something about myself. I've learned something about my choices, and I've been able to focus on, you know, avoiding that or getting better at that. And so I think having high expectations, but allowing those failures to happen and then being there to help correct them in a non-judgmental way is another thing that I think as men we can do. And then another thing is I have had the luck, and I mean pure luck, blessing to have grandfathers and dads and men in my life who were exemplary men. But being that for boys who don't. There are many boys that don't have men that they can point to say, that's a good man. That's someone I want to be like. That's how I want to solve problems. That person will hold me to a standard, have an expectation. Yeah. And I think that all comes along with expectations. And then the idea that, yeah, we all have agency. Absolutely. We all have the ability to make choices, but our choices, our agency affects many others, and understanding that you're part of a community. I think that's another way in which boys are going, which is they don't realize how much of a community or part of a community they are, that their actions affect others, whether they see them or not.
Right. Or how much they need a community, even if they pretend like they don't.
Absolutely. I mean, the more kids are online, the more kids are siloed, which happens, right? I mean, it happens even in just kids playing in neighborhoods. I mean, I remember as a kid, I'm sure you do. We don't need to reminisce too much, but you know, there was a ballpark 2 blocks from my house. That's where everyone went.
Yeah.
You know, we played outside night games all summer long. I had communities of kids and all of that. And that's lost in our communities. Not to say it's better or worse. There's, I'm sure, bad things that happen that way, but a sense of community, but also your role, your part, that you are part of that community. You let people down. You make people proud. You have pride in your choices and in your family and your community. Pride is usually looked at as a bad thing, but I think it can also be a really powerful thing. When you're not strong enough to do it for yourself, you're brought up and you have pride in the others around you that you don't want to let down.
Isn't that the distinction between having pride versus being prideful?
Yes, absolutely.
Those are different things. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's the community thing. That's huge. One of the trends we've been noticing in talking with buyers, I don't know if it's in the last few years or if it's always been there, but we're just now more aware of it, is just the sense of loneliness and disconnection. So if you think about what you're saying to young men, like to realize the value and the necessity of community, you fast forward that life to now they're full grown men feeling really profound disconnection and isolation. That's one of the main contributing factors to sex buying, which drives sex trafficking. So these are not disconnected things. That's huge. I want to give you the last word. I want you to have the last word, but I want you to address a particular group of people. And I want you to address it not as Glen Ujifusa, the senior deputy district attorney or anything, but as JR, a man. What is something you want survivors, victims of trafficking, many of whom have frankly become your friends, our friends? What do you want to say to them?
I try to say to them, sometimes I don't have the ability to. I cannot imagine the courage and strength and ability to do what they do, have done, experienced. And that's just being a survivor, being someone with lived experience. Then I meet them and I ask them to do something extremely difficult and extremely embarrassing and extremely hard. And I have seen some giants of women step up in a courtroom, look their trafficker in the eye, and talk about their victimization in a way that I can't imagine doing that. And so what I'd like to say is I'm behind you. I'm proud of you. I'm honored to be in the same circles or even your friend or associate, but I am in awe of the courage of these survivors, these individuals, because surviving on the streets, surviving the things that they've survived before anything else happens is unimaginable. And no one should have to deal with that. No one should have to have that. And the fact that they have, and they've come out on the other side stronger, willing to lead and to talk and to help others is, I can't really put it into words, but hopefully what I've said is a little piece of how I feel about how honored I am to sit beside you in trial, to hold people accountable that have, in a small way, what they've done to you.
So well said. Thank you, friend. Thanks everyone for just being a part of this conversation. We're really, really grateful to be in it with you. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epicproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epicproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.